Hey folks, Seth here. As we watch cities burn, statues being torn down, and calls to defund the police, if you haven't already, it may be time to think about personal protection. Guns Etc. has 10,200 square feet of guns, ammo, safes, and a staff that will work with you to find the best firearm for your situation. So stop by their huge store in Mesa or click on gunsetc.com and have access to over $400 million in firearms and accessories. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Welcome back and happy September 8th, 2020. The other day I delivered a monologue on what are loosely called the culture wars. These tend to be issues about crime, domestic, social policy, education, entertainment, race. And as I pointed out, Republicans typically try to shy away from them, uncomfortable as they are speaking to them. This has been a crucial mistake because while we may have wanted to avoid these issues, and who doesn't want to avoid a war, these issues were fought for by one side. The battleground existed, and one side took up arms, so to speak. And while the other wished it would just go away, it didn't. As I like to quote Lincoln in his second inaugural, the war came. One might put it this way: you may not be interested in the culture or the culture wars, but the culture and the culture wars are interested in you. This is why we lamentably ask, how did this happen? We look around our schools, Hollywood, the media, our entertainment, sports, and ask, how did this happen? Why and when? Some of us have described it as the left's long march through the institutions. That phrase, the long march through the institutions, is the concept of a German Marxist named Rudi Dutschke. I used it to explain how our schools and everything around us, our culture, fell to the left. It is done by, quote, working against the established institutions while also working within them, as Herbert Marcuse put it. I can give example after example, but for illustration, I like the story of the woman almost hit by a car jaywalking, running across a major street in Los Angeles. She was almost hit by a car because she was carelessly running late to a school board meeting to discuss and vote on the curriculum. This probably happens something like 10,000 times a year in America, maybe more, and it probably never involves a conservative. The long march can sometimes be a short run, I guess. But you combine that sort of thing with the radicals of the 1960s taking over the professoriate in the elementary and secondary school system, and poof, before you even know it, within maybe just a little more than a decade, they have all our schools, or most of them. Our reaction was to not go to these school board meetings. Our reaction was to think everything would generally work out, and work out well, because we can all tolerate tares among the wheat. But by being complacent, we awoke to see few wheat fields and an awful lot of fields of chaff. Soon the wheat, the good stuff, became the exception, if not the invader. I read in the Washington Post today a story about the new College Board curriculum. This is the group that writes and manages the SAT as well as other academic processes and tests like the AP or Advanced Placement curriculum that you may be familiar with. The title of the story in the Post this morning, quote, "New College Board curriculum puts the African diaspora in the spotlight," close quote. As Maud Lebowski would say, you can imagine where it goes from there. And no, they are not fixing the cable or our schools. They are adding to the ruin and the rot. A high school senior at Medgar Evers College Prep in Brooklyn, New York, says this, quote, "My understanding of African wasn't what it is now." The student's family is from Grenada. She goes on, quote, "I wouldn't have wanted to be identified as an African at first. At the beginning of the course, I would have just said I was an African American, and I couldn't put down both African American and Afro-Caribbean on the census. So at the end of the day, I just say I'm of African descent now. I know I'm proud of where I come from," close quote. Remember, once upon a time, public school proponents, typically what you might call liberals, used to tell us the reason public schools were so important to them was to integrate our youth into the great American family and project. Some years ago, we warned of something we thought terrible, and it got worse. Mark Krikorian wrote of two sociologists who followed thousands of children of immigrants in San Diego and Miami over several years, surveying them when they began high school and then again as they were finishing. Their research covered many issues, including the students' national self-identification. At the beginning of high school, the majority identified as American in some form, either simply or in some hyphenated form, such as Filipino American or Cuban American. After several years of American high school, the primary institution tasked with imparting civic consciousness to young people, barely 1/3 still identified as American, with most adopting either a foreign national identity, Cuban or Filipino, or a pan-racial identity, Hispanic, Asian. We may used to have hyphenated Americans, which was bad enough. Now we've just dropped the hyphen and the American part. Meanwhile, Gallup finds that nearly 800 million people worldwide would like to move and leave their country. And what is their top destination? America. So people want to move here, and they do move here because of our greatness. Then we put them in our school system, and they learn how dumb and stupid or backwards or unconscious their parents or grandparents were to migrate here. So they take on the identity of the country they or their families left. They are more proud, in the words of the Brooklyn Senior, of the country their parents and grandparents fled than the country that welcomed them and they fled to. This is not a natural happenstance or occurrence. One has to be carefully taught this way or to think this way. Now, I'm not sure when this student's parents or grandparents came from Grenada, but to the degree Grenada is a democracy at all, it's thanks to the United States military. To quote then Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick, the Blame America First crowd didn't blame the Cubans and communists for attempting to plunge Grenada into terror and totalitarianism in 1983 and threatening American students and murdering Grenadians. They blamed the United States instead. Funny how it wasn't Grenada that saved the United States, but it is the United States that saved Grenada and then absorbed Grenadian immigrants whose descendants now prefer to affiliate as Grenadians rather than Americans. As for the new curriculum to carefully teach our students not to be Americans, I'm going to guess in all their readings about their diaspora, they will not be reading Keith Richburg's book. You'll recall Mr. Richburg, African-American, former foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, author of the book Out of America. He went back to Africa to trace his family's origins and came back and wrote, quote, "There but for the grace of God go I. And I thank God my ancestors made the voyage to America. I empathize with Africa's pain. I recoil in horror at the mindless waste of human life and human potential. I salute the gallantry and dignity and sheer perseverance of the Africans, but most of all, I feel secretly glad that my ancestors made it out, because now I am not one of them." Close quote. Now I am not one of them. What was he? Proud, delighted, happy, thrilled, grateful, all of it, that he was an American. But we do everything we can in our acculturation to make sure immigrant children do not understand this, because the real S-hole country to our academic and educational cultural elites is America. Never mind the fact that more than 2 million Africans immigrated to the United States in the recent past, as Dennis Prager points out. The American curriculum writers labor to show how much more they know about this country than immigrants' parents and grandparents. The truth is they know less. And they know even less about the plight and blight of the countries our immigrants fled, or why they fled in the first place, or that they fled. And we fight none of this, or didn't. I was speaking of how the culture war came, borrowing from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he said, quote, "Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came," close quote. Yes, both parties deprecated war, but perhaps not in the same way today. The left did not want a fight and did not expect a fight because it was never given a fight. But note what Lincoln says next in his inaugural, as we, per him, analogize to the Civil War. Quote, "Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph, and as a result, less fundamental and astounding," close quote. Yes, the left wanted an easy triumph in our culture conf, and until about November of 2016, we gave them one. But we looked around to find the imminent results quite fundamental and astounding, to use Lincoln's words. So we began to fight back, and it was late. It is late. And in our fighting back, you see how the other side plays. Claims of racism, claims of illegitimacy, claims of fraud, claims of foreign interference, claims of all kinds of illegality and dishonesty. Lincoln had that too. But he asked early on in his presidency whether discontented individuals, too few in numbers to control administrations, according to organic laws in any case, in other words, not big enough to constitute the majority of the American people, he asked, can they always, upon the pretenses made in this case or in any other pretenses, or arbitrarily without any pretense, break up their government, and thus practically put an end to free government on earth by their actions? It forces us to ask, he said, is there in all republics this inherent and fatal weakness? Must a government of necessity be too strong for the liberties of its own people, or too weak to maintain its own existence? Are we too weak to maintain our own existence? It's obvious to so many of you that this is not a theoretical question any longer, and that our old assumptions, even old liberal assumptions, especially about the unified purpose of our education system, those assumptions can be rested on or assumed no more. The New Yorker magazine this week published an essay by a former Washington Post writer titled, "Is America a Myth?" She summons up and quotes several academics who point out that, yes, the notion of a great America or great American experiment was always a myth to these academics, especially our, as one puts it, quaint, shared experience. There is none, he says. Well, yes, of course, but that is because the left destroyed that shared experience. We were never that great, you know. The whole family of man cannot abide natural rights to equality and liberty. Heck, it can't even celebrate the year 1776, so how could we do e pluribus unum? The idea of the specialness of America and the unity it can provide, indeed had provided for nearly 200 years, with a 4-year war to ensure its unity, that idea must not and cannot carry the day with the modern left. So they disunite us and then tell us we were never united. Good schools, and indeed the whole point of public schools, was centered on this. We used to teach St. John de Crevecoeur in his 18th century book. I spoke about it the other day, Letters from an American Farmer. There he famously asked, what then is the American, this new man? He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. Americans are the Western pilgrims who are carrying along with them that great mass of art, science, vigor, and industry which began long since in the East. The American ought therefore to love this country much better than that wherein either he or his forefathers were born. Try teaching that today. Try teaching that. For here, Crevecoeur says, the rewards of his industry follow with equal steps the progress of his labor. The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. He must therefore entertain new ideas and form new opinions. From involuntary idleness, servile dependence, penury, and useless labor, he has passed to toils of a very different nature, rewarded by ample subsistence. This is an American. Today, the schools in America, or the schooling in America, is for none of this, especially that loving this country part, or loving it more than from whence you came. So we are forced to ask the Ronald Reagan question from the Cuban immigrant in 1964. Once we are done destroying and disunifying ourselves, what country do people escape to? Something tells me, despite our making it a much better place, it won't be Grenada. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.